Our two honorees are joined here on the podium with Douglas Baker, Chair and CEO of Ecolab, for the panel discussion. And I'm quite sure that all of you know about Ecolab and the splendid things that it is doing as a global leader in water, hygiene, energy technology, and services that protect people and vital resources. Doug joined Ecolab in 1989, becoming president and CEO in 2004 and chairman of the board in 2006. He also serves on the board of Target Corporation and U.S. Bancorp. He's involved in a number of community initiatives in the Minnesota and St. Paul area, including as a member of the committee encouraging corporate philanthropy. Newsweek recently ranked Ecolab in the top 5 for corporate responsibility. Forbes put it on its list for America's best employer, and Fortune lists it as the world's most admired companies. And I could say a great deal more about Doug Baker, but then we wouldn't have enough time for our panel. So our plan is to have a discussion among the four of us, and we'll try to stay on the time I've noted when Christy told me that I should be finished. And so let me start with the issue that you've all raised, and that is the problem of economic nationalism. You know, since World War II, whether under Democratic or Republican administration, our nation has been strongly in favor of free flow of goods, services, and ideas. And economic studies have validated that position. Dr. Huffbauer over at the Peterson Institute for International Economics calculates that the United States GDP is $1 trillion richer by reason of our opening of our markets. But it isn't just rich countries that have benefited. Dr. William Klein has also determined that when a poor country increases its ratio of trade to its output by just 1%, it lowers its percentage of poverty by 1%. Mm-hmm. And so this is something that is not only good for our nation, but it is very good for the world. But skepticism, particularly I'd say in the Western world, has grown in recent years. Many believe that trade and globalization has hurt them. Let me start with our champions of free trade. And Bob, how do we rebuild the consensus for keeping global markets open?
Well, it starts with groups like this, and it starts with people all around the country recognizing that trade is important. As I mentioned, you know, as we went through the election, I was watching closely some of the polls, and it depends on how questions are asked. But what is striking is that in a number of these polls, the support for trade among the general public was 55, 57, opposition sort of high 30s, support for TPP with the Pacific or transatlantic was 60% to some 30%. But it's the intensity of the opposition that matters the most. So it's those that feel that they're hurt. So, I mean, part of it is the fact that, you know, you have certain parts of the business community that have been well organized. We've got some people that represent the agricultural community here. Because agriculture has been well organized in the United States for over 100 years. They also play a strong role on trade. But what I found, I don't know if you encounter this too, is that some of the newer industries, including the high-tech industries, that frankly are going to live and die off a global system, were a little slow in pushing trade. I could never get the votes from the 2 congresswomen from Silicon Valley, and neither could Mike Froman, who was here last year in a Democratic post. And I think it's because, look, people in Congress respond to the messages they get, and that just wasn't a priority. Maybe now it will be as people start to see some of the downside. But it's also a point I think that Angel and I have touched about. You have to help people adjust to change. So, and if the change is rapid, this can be so destabilizing, and it scares people. And you can't just answer fear with facts. You have to be able to help people look to a future. So, I mean, part of the point that I'm frustrated about our current approach is I think it's a fraud. You're not going to be able to get these jobs back in some of these older industries. They'll be replaced by technology, or they'll go to another market. What we need to be doing is trying to help open markets for some of the companies that you have around here that will create jobs, but also help people adjust. So let me just give you one example. And different perspectives on this, but I personally believe the federal government should be a little bit more experimental, but because it's easy once you start to spend money, that you keep spending money, that you do it as pilots and you sunset it and you test it. So let me give you a practical example. I alluded to this in my remarks. Some economists have come up with the idea of sort of a wage support. And the idea would be, let's say you're making $50,000 a year at a job. You lose a job, maybe you can get another one at 30, but you don't want a job at 30 because you're used to the one at 50. If, however, you believe that people are probably best trained in the workplace, and if you think that work and jobs have a sense of dignity for the family, maybe you say, take the job at 30, we'll make up some of that $20,000 difference for a certain number of years. And you could put a cap on it, whether for a number of years, so if you say 50% of the $20,000 difference, then it's $10,000, maybe you do that for 1 or 2 years or something. I don't know whether that'll work, but frankly, I think the idea of getting people back into the workforce and back into jobs is going to be more important. I alluded to something else in terms of certification. I think this is going to need to be part of our, Minnesota is very fortunate to have some very good public and private educational institutions. I think increasingly, as opposed to having 4-year degrees or 2-year degrees or whatever the length is, you're going to have to start to focus on certification for knowledge. And people are going to have to get used to be doing this kind of their whole life. I've seen a number of businesses now that frankly are working with educational companies to develop these systems, because in many sectors of the U.S. economy, you got jobs that people can't fill just because they don't have the training. So I think it has to be a multidimensional effort, but the key will be, it won't be successful unless we help people adjust to change as opposed to try to stop it, which they won't be able to do. But on the other hand, I also think that politically, you need people that are willing to stand up for this and recognize that it connects people with the world. One other small point, the politics of this, of course, drive a lot of it, something we've had to deal with. It's interesting now, Democratic voters are more pro-trade than Republican voters, okay? And it's partly younger voters. It doesn't show up with the Democratic Congress yet because of the influence of the unions, who have kind of had their attitude that they have to be against trade. Now, I could never understand why government unions would be against trade, since it just lowers the cost of their goods. But nevertheless, it's become part of an ideology. And so I think on the Republican side, the question, frankly, will be whether the Republicans will keep majorities for trade, given the president's position. And on the Democratic side, the question is maybe some of the younger voters can move some of the Democrats so we can create a little bit more of a bipartisan approach.
Let me ask Doug, how can business help? We have 5 million jobs in the United States that are crying for skilled workers. Whether we give a tax credit and some kind of a stipend to move somebody from the mining job they lost in Virginia to Arizona, where the job is there, or do we create a public-private partnership for those companies that need workers and train them? What can we do through the business community to make a change in the atmosphere that exists today?
Well, I have the single answer.
Yes.
I wish. I would say there's a number of things. I think companies are starting to realize that the training responsibility that I think we used to take on, then we sort of offloaded, we are taking back on. And there's a lot of examples. So I would agree with you. I think there's a number of ways that we're going to have to help people move from one job to another. I think it's been an ignored part. Fear has taken over. And this is not the first time this country's dealt with isolationism or anti-trade or anything else, or any other country. It seems to be sort of what happens when people become overly fearful and then people play on it. And that's exactly the scenario that we've had. And so it's been an emotional argument is trumping an intellectual argument. And I think the intellectual argument, I mean, we just heard two great presentations of it, is overwhelmingly strong. But it right now isn't resonating in an environment where people are fearful about future and they're looking to demonize. And I think you put it very well, right? They want to choke something, so they're choking a trade treaty, at this point in time. So I think companies do have to think differently about this, but we also have to work within the community. And you, Bob, I think in your talk said, Minnesota would be a unique place to be able to do this. I agree. We're only, we're less than 6 million people. It's kind of a small microcosm. We've got large institutions. We have enough money, probably wherewithal to go do this. And there's a lot of little pilot programs. But as I was saying to you earlier, Carlo, when we were over there, I said, we're all preaching to the choir here. And you said, yeah, but the choir's not singing. It was exactly your line. I agree with that. I think, I think there's not enough. And I sat there and said, I plead guilty. I am absolutely for trade. It's absolutely critical to the success of this country, success of this state, success of this community, success of our company. Our company will survive without these trade agreements. We'll figure out how to finagle around it. I'll move, frankly, production out of the U.S. into other countries. It'll be a perverse answer because if they put these barriers up and we have tariffs, okay, we'll start making this stuff elsewhere. Right now we do about 14 billion and we're making about 8 billion here, 6 billion outside. So that extra 1 billion is export at this time. All right, I'll get rid of that. I'll start making 7 and 7. Right, in doing this. In fact, that's exactly what we're trying to figure out in Europe as a consequence of British exit. Mm-hmm. So we do have to tackle, I think, the root cause here of the angst, which is this there's a lost piece of society. Mm-hmm. And I think if you look at what globalization has done, it's helped the very poorest around the world. It has, dramatically. And obviously the richest have got richer. And the middle class has been left behind. I don't know if that's globalization or 1 billion workers coming into the marketplace as a consequence of China, India, and Asia opening up, which I think had a huge impact, but we can't understand it, so we can't talk about it. And I think that impact's largely been swallowed. If you look at labor and rates and other things coming up, they're starting to come up, but it's sort of too late. The argument and the demon is now globalization and free trade. So I do think we're going to have to go tackle this fear piece in our communities by getting after the hardest neighborhoods, making sure opportunities there, doing the stuff we need to do inside our companies to make sure that we can help people move from one part of the workforce into another. And that's going to take more investment and training and everything else. I don't think we're going to have a choice in the near term. I think labor shortages are here right now. I don't think they exist long term because of technology, but I think for the next 5-10 years, we're dealing in a labor short market, and we're going to have to get after training and helping people move up and increase our investment. So I'm going to go back and try to figure out what we're going to do on a number of these things, and I don't think we're doing enough, and the community could probably rally around and do a lot more.
Next time I come to Minnesota, I'm going to hear the choir sing.
Exactly.
Angel, we've got a challenge here. What can the OEC do to help us reduce the skepticism about globalization that, if it goes further, will actually reduce growth and opportunity, not only for the United States, North America, but for the world at large?
Well, Bob alluded to the fact that the way companies have integrated over the years responded to their own interest, the way they saw their own self-interest, being best served. And what you, as I mentioned myself, what you did was create the framework and allow for the conditions to be there so that the businessmen and women could do their own thing, what they do better, which is find out what their natural partnerships can do, the complementation, and how do you do the tasks that are necessary to actually drive a product to market and be successful. And I was told, don't come up with facts. Try to find common ground. He said, but how can you find common ground if you don't come up with facts? And second, we are evidence-based. We are about facts. We cannot resign ourselves or say we are not going to go. Actually, what we got to do is more facts. In fact, strengthen the case. But strengthen the case in a way which is not like, preaching or, preceptive. It basically making the case by having the choir sing, by having the private sector. What actually made NAFTA go over the last hurdles and get the last votes? It was that you, together with the Mexicans, got together and made small little squares in the map and said, Congressman, Senator, company, governor, and then everybody wrote to their congressman. The congressman made representations. The senators made representations. And in the end, the president, the Secretary of Commerce, the USTR, etc., finally could get their votes together. Now, in the end, there were some additional negotiations to satisfy some of the Floridians, I remember, and but about something about sugar and orange juice. But what's a bit of orange juice among friends? But the question is what can we do? What actually do we do? We've been calculating the benefit of trade. We went all out to very strongly recommend TPP. We said, who is going to win? How much? We went all out and say TTIP, with Europe, because it was a natural. There's 40% of the world's trade. It's a natural. It was a kind of something that now we got stuck with the investor dispute, investor-state dispute settlement, and also please understand the Europeans. You can accuse them of many, many things, but not of being very fast. They are 28, and they deliberate, and they're 28, and they're 28 sovereign countries. In the end, it's about consensus, and it's very complicated. But it was something that was going on, moving on, because everybody was convinced that that was a good idea. And now what we have is this hiatus, this apparent view that maybe bilateral agreements could be better, or that these multilateral agreements or regional agreements perhaps are not in the best interest. Well, I'd say that the question is, how does one test these propositions? And I mentioned a moment ago, beware, do not get the enemy wrong. Do not get the battle wrong. Because then, as I said before, you have two problems. One is that you fight a wrong battle, and therefore you waste a lot of ammunition, capital, and political capital, whatever, but also because you don't address the real issues. Now, the question of skills, for example, it was mentioned several times here. We have created a world in which there are millions and millions and millions of people unemployed. several millions more than before the crisis, by the way. And at the same time, the companies are complaining they can't get the right jobs. They can't get the right skills filled. So, what an enormous paradox, and what a terrible waste, too. But what does it tell us? That we got the education wrong, that we got the vocational training wrong, that we got the lifelong learning wrong, or that it's not happening, that vocational training actually is not happening. I just presented the economic survey of Japan, and about 40% of the workforce there is now informal, does not have permanent, protection, permanent. This is Japan. I mean, we're not talking about a developing country. We're not talking about an emerging economy. Duality of labor is growing in practically every country in the world. And the lack of skills has become the single most, let's say, it's really heartfelt need. Whenever we go to a country and say, well, you did it for Korea, you did it for Norway, please, let's do a skills strategy here, so we've done it now for, we've done it for Mexico, we've done it for Italy, we've done it for Spain, we did it for Portugal, we did it for, Norway and many others. So it's why? Because skills, as I said it 3 times during my initial remarks, are not there. More than half of the workforce today cannot deal properly with a digital rich world. They are uncomfortable, they feel they can't, they feel angst, and they feel very vulnerable, not only because they can be displaced by technology or machines, but simply because they are not qualified enough, and therefore they can't deal with these tools and these utensils that they're now giving and that they're supposed to. Now, these are the kinds of things that we are confronting now. We are we are in a society where we have found the most wonderful discoveries, and Ecolab, we just visited today. It's just an extraordinary place where you see how far we can go, how far we can reach. And then the question is, how far are we? And then you say, we are so far. We are very far in terms of being able to use these technologies, this progress, etc. So what, again, can we do to continue to put in front of public groups like this one, not to convince you about free trade, but to give you more arguments, to kind of strengthen your conviction, to send you out there to the battle and saying it's not enough that you're convinced, it's not enough that you believe in free trade. You have to go out there and fight the battle. You have to go out there and say it. You have to go out and defend it. And you have to make the arguments. And you also, have to know that organizations or institutions like the OECD are there precisely to fuel these arguments and these indicators and to continue to make the case for trade.
Well, we have talked a lot about the slowdown in the global economy, but one bright spot is the Asia-Pacific region. 9 out of the 15 economies out in the Asia-Pacific region are the fastest growing. And interestingly, their trade agreements have expanded 400% since the year 2000. The United States recently withdrew from the Trans-Pacific Partnership, and that has raised questions about our political and our economic commitment to the region. Let me turn back to Bob and say, going forward, what can the United States now do to strengthen our economic and our trade relationship with Asia? What would your advice be?
Well, one option is whether people return to the path that we were on. And I just want to emphasize a little bit so people have a sense of how this comes together. The TPP, the Trans-Pacific Partnership, was with 11 other economies. We already had free trade agreements with 6 of those. So in effect, what you were doing is you were integrating those 6, adding 5 more, of which Japan was by far the biggest. You also had Vietnam, Malaysia, Brunei, and New Zealand, and modernize it. Because, for example, you had NAFTA as one of the agreements, and over 20 years, there were things that, for example, rules of the digital economy. It's hard for me to believe that President Trump, with his rhetoric, is going to get back on that track. But I'm not really sure what he believes, because he changes around a lot, too. But so one of the options here will be, I saw in the news today that Prime Minister Abe of Japan, who is the big player in this, said, look, maybe we should go forward without the United States. And maybe if they do that, then they preserve an option for the United States going forward in some fashion. That's one possibility. A second possibility is that we proceed separately with Japan, and you start, then at some later point, you come back and reintegrate. A third possibility is that you try to find some sectors like digital commerce and others, and you try to get an agreement of a sector as opposed to getting the country as a whole. But I don't want to sugarcoat it for people, because I want to come back to the point that Angel mentioned. What worries me the most about the administration's approach to trade is they've misdiagnosed the problem, and the actions they're likely to take are not going to deal with what they should be doing. Okay. So the misdiagnosis is this. You'll hear President Trump and Wilbur Ross and others talk a lot about bilateral trade deficits. That is the main thing that troubles them. That's why with Mexico, we have a bilateral trade deficit, with Japan, with Korea, with Germany. So those are on the target list. Okay? Bilateral trade deficit is the wrong target. We have a surplus with Australia. Australia has a surplus with China. China has a surplus with us. So what have we learned about the nature of bilateral trade deficit? Not surprisingly, we're going to have a bilateral trade deficit with Saudi Arabia, because they sell oil and we use oil. Although the more we have at home, the less that we need to have. So this idea that all economies are supposed to end up in balance, it's kind of like, frankly, when I go to the supermarket, I'm in deficit to the supermarket, okay? But whoever pays me is in deficit to me. And so it works actually that way. You can trade, right? But so the idea that with each country it's supposed to be sort of equal is a totally mistaken concept, okay? Frankly, even if you take the idea of a negative trade deficit for the country as a whole, you have to keep in mind what causes that. Well, basically, it's that the United States is either consuming or investing more than we're saving. That means that in doing that, that means somebody has to have dollars to invest in the U.S. or to loan us the dollars so we consume. And to get those dollars, they sell us more goods than we buy. That's what drives an overall global trade deficit or surplus. So if you want to change that, you want to have policies that either cut your consumption or investment. I don't think cutting investment would be a very good idea. Or you want to increase your savings. And one of the most telling ways of explaining this is the United States had a trade surplus during all the Great Depression. So was that good? We had 25% unemployment and a trade surplus. Yeah. So what we ought to look at is employment, growth, productivity, not the bilateral or even the sort of global trade surplus. So number one, in kind of Angel's point, they're fighting the wrong war. Okay, now moreover, if their goal is to reduce the bilateral trade deficit, you watch, and you're already seeing this with China. It will say, okay, we want to stop some of their imports, or frankly, the Chinese will sort of put forward some of the stuff that they were already moving on with beef and other things, so they should open the market. But my worry is we're not focusing on what we really should be focusing on with China. So when I was at the World Bank, we worked with the Chinese to develop what is called the China 2030. It was the foundation for their notion of structural reform. It's the fear of the middle income trap. And just to give people a sense of this and why this is very much in the Chinese thinking. In 2008 at the World Bank, we went and looked at the 101 countries that we had classified as middle income in 1960. So this is 2008, almost 50 years later. Of those 101 countries, only 13 had made it to high income, and one was Greece. So you decide whether it's 12 or 13. The point is, it's hard to make that next leap. So the Chinese are now, and it's in their plan, they have an economic plan, are really focusing on value-added and technology sectors. There's some stuff in there that would be really bad because it's indigenous, it would keep the United States out. There's other things that are basically ways you bring in venture capital, ways you have education, ways you sort of transform markets. Could be good or bad. We're not paying attention to that. That's the future. Angel talked about the services sector. China has got to expand its consumption. It's got to move away from the traditional investment. And it's got, as part of that, you're going to have to expand services. So there's an article in the Wall Street Journal today about, China bought AMC movie theaters, second largest movie theaters, now the largest in the world. That's part of the consumption and urbanization pattern of China. So are we working to try to expand entry of US firms in that area, or environmental services or others in China? No. We want to protect the steel industry. Well, guess what's going to happen? Steel prices are going to go up, as you already started to see. And so fine, we'll protect the steel industry, and the industries of the future will be somebody else's. That doesn't look like a winning formula for me. And part of this goes back to this heart of adjustment for change. Keep in mind, around 1900, about 40 to 50% of Americans were involved in agriculture. Now it's about 1%, and they're far more productive. So you're going to have fewer people involved with manufacturing. We'll be producing more because we'll be competitive and productive. So then it's the question about the future sectors. So the two key points that I'm worried about are, number one, they're directing their fire at the wrong target, and they're going to ignore the ones that we should be working on. So I'd be, as you know, and you'd be the same way, Carl, I'd be happy to be highly aggressive with countries about opening things. But to be aggressive about how we're going to close ourselves off, that's a fool's errand.
Carla, just a comment on this about getting the diagnostic wrong. Ken Ash, who's the director of trade of the OECD, produced a series about trade and value added. So he netted out with a large number crunching operation with microdata, netted out all the cases and all the times when a part goes back and forth through borders, and they're multiplied, and that inflates artificially the size of the trade. If you net out and just look at value-added numbers, which is really where does the value lie and stay? China is about a third less. In the case of Mexico, about 40% of Mexico's exports to the United States are American products. Right. And you did this in that PowerPoint, which you signed together with other former ambassadors and others just to make this awareness. So, but the thesis, or the way in which now this is being addressed, is saying, well, we have 300 billion deficit with China, which is, we said it's about 200. In the case of Japan, or maybe Germany second, Japan third, Mexico fourth. But the numbers, in particular because of the very, very high integration level between Mexico and the United States, are about half of that. So you're really looking, again, when you're looking at the diagnostics and you're looking at you would be taxing, or you would be blocking the exports of the United States, the first round towards Mexico, and then stopping there, coming back into the United States to make American companies productive and competitive in the United States against other foreign companies, and then in other countries around the world. So there's a multiplication of, of damage by not allowing these things, as I said, to just be led by the private sector, the businessmen and women who know how to do these things.
Yeah, leave us alone.
Yeah, but frankly, Doug, with some help from the officials.
Open it up, let us
No,
go.
that create the mechanisms and create the vehicles, etc.
I agree.
But again, it's a question of, even when you're looking at a problem, let's say in a very simplified way, who do we have a deficit or who do we have a surplus with? It may be that it is an oversimplified thing, therefore leads you to wrong conclusions.
I mean, we've mentioned Asia Pacific as a growth area. We've mentioned the trade deficit as not the right target that we should be aiming at. Your views?
Well, I'd only add, and part of this is I read a few articles of Bob's, and I agree with this. There's another factor with trade, which is geopolitical. And it's just as important as everything else, which is you start trading with partners, you have influence, you have stability, you have currency, ultimately long-term, which doesn't require military all the time as you go through. And I always thought the big miss in the TPP was just that. And so we're kind of at a tipping point about influence and everything else in this world. And to me, I think we're blinking at exactly the wrong time. So we're opening up. China is going to go try to drive this if we don't. And ultimately, you would rather be at the table writing the rules than sitting receiving the rules. And ultimately, that's my big fear as we go. So I agree. Open it up. Let people do commerce. Figure it out. I think your supermarket analogy is a good one. I will steal that in terms of helping understand how this works. I have a trade imbalance, frankly, with a lot of people I'm learning. So, but I would also, and I want to get back to another point, which is a little bit education, training, and the like.
Right.
There is this belief, and the states and governments have tried to co-opt a lot of the training and the training responsibility, and I think incorrectly. And so we have here in this community wonderful secondary schools and primary schools, and then some that were really abysmal. And we are damning a number of kids to really an unsuccessful life because they're not graduating. Like less than half are graduating. So we have the 50th out of 50 states graduation rate and 49th of African American and Hispanic. And we have top with whites. And I mean, this is a really big problem for this community, but this isn't only here. I mean, nobody else can be 50th. But this problem is fairly pervasive. And so we're damning a number of folks because we're not giving them the education. I would say beyond that. So that's something we have to go fight for. You got to go fight change. We're trying to. And it's not an easy fight. It gets politicized very quickly. And the people that get lost are the kids that are coming through this damn system. And it's a very, very difficult thing. And I'd say the next thing is then training. So we are looking for people, and there are supposedly all these people who are looking for work. And how do you marry these folks and get through this? And I would say we're looking for engineers. Okay, just a shortage of engineers graduating, so we hire them in other places. We now have a center in Pune, India, where we have 65. I think there's 40 PhDs. Most of them were educated in the US, but we couldn't get each one. I mean, it's all this calamity. I mean, it's a ridiculous story if you go through it. And then they'll quit us and they'll start a company and it will be in India, not in the US, unfortunately. But I would also say this training, we also have jobs of people we need to fix refrigeration and cooking equipment. It's not the sexiest work in the world. It pays pretty darn well, doesn't require a college education. We can't find these people. And we get ripped off all the time because we train them and then they get hired for 50 cents more an hour by somebody else. It's not the most thoughtful move on everybody's part, but it happens. But if you go to the state to try to get training dollars, they won't give them to you. It's got to go to a third-party institution. So we get taxed. The money gets sent to the state or to the federal. I am not like a right-wing nut, don't worry. But you think about this. This is what's happening. Money's been taken from us, sent over there, and now it's sitting in there in that training fund, and it's horribly ineffective. It's not working. And so some of this, all of us, whether you're a Democrat, Republican, Independent, we've got to walk into this with open eyes, what's really happening, what's really working. And I would say both parties have good ideas and really stupid ideas, and trying to bifurcate which is which and understand what's going on, I think is all of our responsibility. And it's a little bit time to stand up, time to take a point of view, time to drive change in places you can drive it, global, national, local, wherever you can influence. I do think it's really fundamentally our responsibility, and none of us are doing enough of it, starting with me. So I will just say that. And you guys have pushed me a little bit tonight. So if nothing else, that's happened.
Well,
Thank you.
we've spent more time than was allocated to the panel, so I'm going to go to the audience before the clock ticks further. Is there anyone who has a question? If you do, please, right over here to my right. Yes, sir.
Could they introduce themselves?
Do you have a mic? Yes, they're coming. It's coming.
Would you mind introducing yourself?
Yes, I will. I'm John Pornor from 3M. It's a pleasure to hear all of you and the perspectives. I think it's a breath of fresh air, certainly for me. One of the things that happened after World War II was the creation of a number of very creative institutions, World Bank, IMF, the Bretton Woods Agreement, et cetera. You talked about education. The GI Bill was what created a wave of education for the country. Do you think today, given the structural changes that are happening in the world economy, do we need new institutions?
Do you want to?
Well, I'll start. I think the institutions that were created continue to have to evolve. So the World Bank of 2007 and 12 that I dealt with was a totally different institution, the one that was created. It actually had different types of support. There was a different funding mechanism for the poorest called IDA that was long-term loans with almost zero interest. There was a private sector arm. And just to give you a small example of how the leadership of institutions has to recognize the times, our private sector investments were moving to equity as well as various debt forms. And I saw that we were getting about 22% IRR from our investments in sub-Saharan Africa. But given the capital structure, I couldn't expand that. I created something that, frankly, it's always surprised me. It never got more attention in the international system. I created a subsidiary, an asset management corporation, which allowed me to get investments from sovereign wealth funds and pension funds and others, basically piggybacking our investment record. And for some, it was also the idea that they eventually wanted to invest more in sub-Saharan Africa, but they'd start with us, gave them a little protection, and also they'd learn in the marketplace. It's a small example, but it kind of, it gives you a sense of the evolution. Or let me take you one on the other side. You'll hear this discussion about, well, is it just sort of rich or poor? You know, one of the most difficult areas in the field of development are fragile or post-conflict states, because it's not really just an economic issue, it's a security, it's a governance issue. And you tend to have people that specialized in their areas and they couldn't really cross borders. So if you talk to security people in a post-conflict state, they'll say, look, the most important thing is get people jobs, because otherwise, you know, young men will become mobs or gangs, or somebody can pay them to put bombs in places. So that, I don't care, I want to give them money to get jobs. The economists will say, oh, no, that's make work, you know, that's not sustainable, it'll affect the labor rate, wage rate, and so on and so forth. And so I kind of launched an effort to try to say, well, what's worked in different places, you know, and kind of what can we learn from, and can there be various public works projects and sort of other efforts. And, you know, this is frankly going to be the story of Afghanistan or Iraq, as well as the Cote d'Ivoires and the Liberias. And so it has effects on us in many different ways. So the institutions have to keep changing. That's one point. The second point, however, is, you know, particularly since the middle of the 20th century, the private capital flows dwarf what is done in the public side. So if you're doing flows from a World Bank or IMF or others, you really have to think about how you catalyze private sector investment, including by having countries make it a positive environment. But even there you can do things. So for example, you remember some of the financial crises in the 90s, it's because people borrowed in dollars, but then their local currency fell, they had a hard time paying back dollars. So we helped to create local currency bond markets so they could fund in local currencies. So there was an aspect. But I'll go one step further. You know, the nature of the system is also going to require things like in the cyberspace, okay? And you know, this is not so easy to think about whether the way it's a deterrence to whether it's a rules-based system. Can you draw analogies that was done with nuclear weapons? So my key point is, look, we live in a world with others, okay? And I'm not of the view that, well, you know, you just make a nice agreement on paper and everything happens. I happen to believe national power remains quite important. But you have to learn how to play with other children, okay? You know, and you have to realize how you can create incentives and how you can create a sense that people, in a sense, want to follow your pattern. And so one of the reasons that I'm frankly so disturbed about the whole North America business is to say, this is a historic change where Mexico, I mean, Angel can tell you this, when I first dealt with foreign policy with Mexico in the 1980s, it was pretty easy to know Mexico's policy. You put the US policy and you put a minus sign in front of it. And the reason why was because, you know, this is a legacy of the Mexican-American War, and a lot of leftist intellectuals went to the foreign ministry and they were engaged in anti-Americanism there. When I came back as US Trade Representative in 2001, my closest partners were my Canadian and Mexican partners, okay? And by the way, look at the number of Mexicans, not just Mexican Americans, in the US Marine Corps. Okay, so the point is, if we can't do it in our home continent, then how are we going to do it elsewhere? And one point coming back to the Asia Pacific, I spend a lot of time in Asia. I serve on a board of Temasek in Singapore, and which is Sovereign Wealth Fund. And what's quite interesting was how much Asians are looking at what's happening with NAFTA in North America. And look, in Asia, you know, economics is the coin of the realm. And they basically say, you know, if you guys screw it up with Mexico, where you've got car parts going over the border 14 times and others, then for those of us in Asia, we can't depend on you. And frankly, we don't want to be totally dependent on the Chinese, but we got to live with what we got, okay? So the broader answer to your question is, look, there's only one country that can still do this, which is the United States. But if we pit our nationalism against internationalism, it's not going to work. So there's a lot at stake with what's going on. I mean, you've got Europe, in European integration being uncertain with Brexit. You know, you've got the Middle East from states broken down into tribes and sectarian warfare. You've got the rise of China. This system that we refer to being created over the past 70 years is very much in flux. It won't be operating in the same way it will be before. But one thing I can guarantee you, if the United States doesn't play a leading role, you're going to go to more disorder than order.
Yeah.
Well, is there another question? Yes. Please, and give your name. And we'll take one more and make the question short, and I would ask the panelists to make their answers
Hi, my
even
name's Doug
shorter.
Bethune, General Mills retiree. Bob, just to throw this back at you, you said if we can't fight fear with facts, what can we fight with? Because we then heard a huge number of facts against what was beneficial about global trade. But if facts aren't working and people are frightened in this country, what do we fight them with?
I think Adho said that, but I'll be happy to answer briefly.
Do you want to do that one?
You go ahead, Adho.
I did mention that, that we have to fight with facts. First of all, because, again, the diagnostic has to be right, and facts are important to know where you start. But then you go a little bit into the other question here, which is to say, who can do better? You know, who can actually fight these fights? Or how can even a country like the United States fight some fights? And I'll give you an example. We're now engaged in a very complex issue, which is the discussion about steel excess capacity. Well, this is because in the last 10 years in China, the steel capacity doubled, assuming that they were going to continue to grow at double digit, and that the world was going to continue to grow and everything. Well, now they're growing at 6.5%, and the rest of the world is going through a very slow growth process. We call it the low growth trap. We think it's a very mediocre medium and long-term outlook, and therefore people are not using as much steel as they used to, and also all this installed capacity that was being projected is now not being used. There's no demand for it. And therefore, prices were coming down because the rules of the market were not being observed in terms of saying, well, if it's not economic, you close it down. In many places, you couldn't close it down because of political considerations, and therefore you had this commercial problem where you basically were making practically every single steel industry in the world, get into very serious trouble or laying off thousands of workers or go bankrupt. That was very difficult to deal bilaterally, practically impossible. In fact, tried. Now it's being done multilaterally, and it came out of the G20. The G20 is an interesting governance, economic and financial governance institution that didn't exist too many years ago. It was actually out of the crisis in 2008 that it was created at leaders level. And we play an important role there, as does the World Bank, as the IMF, the ILO, the WTO. But it's one of the cases where we would not be able to address a very critically important issue, like the excess capacity of a pretty basic commodity, which is steel. And we would have no forum, because bilaterally that's not done. What do you do with climate if not multilaterally? What do you do with trade if not multilaterally? What sense does it have to talk about trade if you're not talking cross-border trade? What do you do with the question of taxes? Transparency of taxes, eliminating the tax havens, etc. Right now, we've made enough progress, and this September, we go on automatic exchange of information on taxes, which means anybody in the world, wherever you are, if you have an account in a third country, the bank is going to inform the financial authority of that country, and that country is going to inform the financial authority of your country of origin, of the citizen that created the account. And this is going to happen for more than 100 countries in the world. Nowhere to hide, okay? So if any of you got, by the way...
Does this include North Dakota and Minnesota?
North Dakota, be careful. Yeah, we know it's a financial center, so it's going to be... But this is another example. So you're talking about the institutions, the international organizations. Multilateralism not only is alive and well, it is extremely important so that the countries individually can do things that they are not capable of doing bilaterally, and also because when you're talking the climate change, where you got 200 countries that signed for a commitment to bring down emissions. Now, the question is, how does one do that with 200 different bilateral agreements? No, obviously not. So there are going to be 70 or 80 countries that are going to sign on the 7th of June at the OECD an agreement, one single agreement, through which they're going to modify 3,500 existing bilateral agreements on to avoid double taxation and impediments on investment, et cetera, et cetera. That never would have been possible had there not been, well, the OECD, but also the political will of the G20 countries to do what? To make it possible for every multinational company to pay their fair share of taxes. No. No double taxation, but neither double non-taxation, okay? And that would not have been possible. So you're saying, should we create new institutions? No, let's, first of all, worry very much about preserving the ones we've created. All of them are, there's a lot of room for all of them, maybe except for the OECD, to improve. Huh? No, but all can be improved. All can work better. All can probably work with less resources, maybe, but we all built them and they have been tested for a particular purpose. And that is because there are issues that have to be dealt with multilaterally, internationally, rather than bilaterally. So in a way, going back to dealing with issues bilaterally there's an inherent risk in that. And that is that we go back to a period where the reason why we developed these international institutions is because we already found that it was not the most efficient way. So that's a kind of an afterthought to your question.
Well, I think that we've overstepped our time, but it was well worth it with these three wonderful panelists. And so give them a strong hand of applause.